In the thick fog of early morning, a veteran named David Kane froze when he saw a little girl trembling on a wooden bridge, her small hand gripping a rope like she was ready to let herself fall into the icy river. He lunged forward just in time, pulling her back from the edge, and that's when he noticed the bruises all over her body, the deep marks on her wrists where ropes had cut into her skin. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her voice barely a whisper cut through him like a blade. "He's going to kill me." Who was he? And how could a child in a town that looked so peaceful carry such a terrifying warning? Morning in that small Midwestern town came wrapped in a thick fog, like somebody had laid a cold grey sheet across the valley. The river under the bridge moved slow but deep, the sound of the water hitting the concrete banks carrying like a tired sigh. David Kane stood at the far end of the bridge, his old army boots grinding against the damp wood, the smell of rusted metal mixing with the chill of the river air. It dragged him right back to nights on watch at some lonely outpost. He hadn't come looking for trouble, just a little quiet in his head. But then his eyes locked on a small figure halfway across. A girl, thin as a stick, her hands clinging to a frayed rope tied to the railing. Her shoulders shook, and the rope twitched in the heavy fog. David stopped cold. He'd seen plenty of misery in war, but something in the way that kids stood there hit him in a place he wasn't ready for. It wasn't an enemy soldier, wasn't a buddy going down in a firefight. It was a child, maybe 9 years old, standing in the middle of that bridge like silence itself was about to swallow her whole. The wind pushed at her dress, and he caught sight of her bony arms marked with bruises, purple and blue like crushed petals. His throat tightened, dry and bitter, as he moved slow, steady, careful not to spook her. When he spoke, it came out low and rough, the kind of voice that once barked orders but now dropped to a whisper. "Sweetheart, let go of the rope." She didn't turn, eyes still fixed on the water below. Her tiny hand clenched so hard her knuckles were bone white. The rope wrapped around her wrist, red grooves dug in, old marks that told of being tied before. David's heart pounded like artillery rounds landing close. He took another step, the planks groaning under his boots. The girl flinched, then rasped out a line that froze him. "He's going to kill me." Just 4 words, but they cut sharper than any blade. This wasn't just a weak moment in a child. This was a shadow, hanging heavy over her life. David drew in a long breath, remembering what it was like pulling wounded men out of fire. Stay calm, move fast. He bent low, arms wide like a shield. "Nobody's going to touch you now," he said, the words half command, half promise. She turned her head just enough, and he saw those big eyes, dark with fear and hollow with exhaustion. Dirt streaked her cheek, a smear of blood on her lip. A sudden gust slammed across the bridge, snapping the rope against the rail. David lunged, grabbed her arm. It felt like grabbing a frozen twig, all bone and cold. She fought out of instinct, the way someone fights when they've been dragged before. He held tighter, pulled her from the edge, wrapping her into the rough, sweat-stained, gunpowder-worn arms of a man who refused to let go. Her body shook hard, her breath breaking like it might stop any second. Right there, with the river crashing below, David heard his own heart pounding in time with the water. He wasn't a soldier carrying the flag anymore. He was just a man holding on to one fragile life, refusing to let it slip, and when she whispered again, "He's going to kill me," he knew this was the start of another kind of fight. One darker, closer, because this enemy wasn't overseas. He was right here, in the middle of this quiet town. David guided Sophie off the bridge, her breathing ragged like a bird that had just escaped a trap. The road toward the edge of town was rough with gravel, the fields on either side grey and damp with leftover fog. The girl didn't say a word, just clung to his arm, her eyes darting like she was afraid that even opening her mouth might summon that shadow she feared. David, a man who'd learned to read the eyes of soldiers under fire, could see it plain there was something heavier hanging over her. He didn't press, just slowed his steps, letting the sound of her shaky footsteps fall in line with his own pounding heart. When they came to a dirt path cutting toward the woods, Sophie stopped short. Her small hand twitched, pointing to a cluster of rusted tin roofs in the distance. David squinted and knew the place, an old line of barns left to rot since the farm shut down years back. One door half torn off, the inside dark as a cave, so quiet he could hear the flap of crows' wings. The hair on the back of his neck stood straight. His gut told him this wasn't just some forgotten shed. He knelt down to her level, voice low. "You were there, weren't you?" Sophie gave the smallest nod, then pressed closer to him. The smell of mildew clung to her clothes, sharp and stale, like she'd just slipped free from a locked room. Those red welts he'd seen on her wrists came rushing back in his mind, clearer now. He decided to move closer. Each step over the wet ground echoed faint and hollow, stirring old memories of midnight patrols overseas. At the doorway he stopped, sucking in the thick smell of mold, rust, and old ash. In the gloom he saw ropes still looped over a beam, a broken chair slumped in the corner, and a torn scrap of pink cloth against the wall. He picked it up with a tremble. It was part of Sophie's dress. His chest tightened, but his mind stayed sharp. He pushed Sophie gently behind him, then stepped fully inside. Thin light broke through cracks in the roof, falling across the floorboards. On the wooden wall he saw faint scratches, thin and ragged, like claw marks from fingernails. A chill ran straight down his spine. These weren't marks of kids playing. They were the kind left by someone desperate to get out. David's jaw locked. He'd stood in a bunker before, listening to muffled cries of captured men behind concrete walls. And now, here in the so-called safety of small-town America, he was staring at the same kind of evidence. He turned, ready to get Sophie away from this place, but then came a sound. A faint noise outside the door. David froze, every sense flaring. His eyes cut quick across the room, fists balling tight by instinct. Sophie shrank against him, burying her face in his arm. Through the gap in the door, he caught a glimpse, a figure standing still. Not some passerby. A tall shape, broad shoulders, a cap pulled low to shadow the face. The person didn't come in, didn't leave either, just stood there, watching. In that thick silence, David heard it, a faint metallic click, the sound of a gun being cocked. David drove Sophie back into town before the fog had even lifted. They sat in his old pickup, the tires crunching over gravel. The girl stayed silent, clutching the torn pink cloth he'd found in the barn. David kept glancing at her small face, his chest heavy. The soldier in him knew. You don't walk away from signs like these. Out there in combat, any trace like that meant somebody's life was hanging by the hour. He pressed the gas, heading straight for the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Cole was standing on the steps, coffee cup in hand, wearing the calm look of a man who figured nothing bad ever really happens in his town. David came up hard, voice tight with urgency. "There's a kid being held in that abandoned barn out by the woods. I saw it with my own eyes, scratch marks, ropes. You need to send someone now." He slapped the piece of torn cloth on the desk like evidence no one could ignore. Cole raised his eyebrows, gave it a quick look, then shrugged. "Kane, I know you just got back, but this town's quiet. What you saw was probably kids messing around. There's no crime here, and you do well to mind your own business instead of stirring people up." The words hit David like a slap. The pressure in his chest roared up, but he held it down. No shouting like on the battlefield, he forced himself steady. "I didn't make this up," he said slow, every word pushed through his teeth. "This girl," he pointed at Sophie, hunched small on the chair. "She's living proof. Her body's covered in bruises. Isn't that enough for you?" Cole sipped his coffee, eyes drifting away. "Could be an accident. Could be her family's tough on her. But I don't see reason to open an investigation. I'll give you some advice. Honest, don't get yourself tangled up in things that aren't yours. You're a soldier. You should know when it's time to pull back." David felt the ground tilt under him. Back in the service, when you reported a threat, at least the commander listened. Here, in his own country, the truth got brushed aside with a couple of cold words. It was like someone had cut his voice right out of him, left him with nothing but a growl in his chest. He locked eyes with Cole, voice like steel. "If you won't act, I will, and when the truth comes out, folks will know you turned away." Cole only shrugged again, the lazy motion of a man used to brushing off trouble. "Do what you want. Just don't come knocking when it all blows past your control." David turned and walked out, fists clenched so tight his knuckles blanched. Sophie clung to his sleeve, shaking. In her eyes he saw himself years ago, a man cut adrift, abandoned inside the cold noise of power. As he led her outside, the late sun cut across the steps, long streaks of light slashing the ground like scars. He knew he'd just lost the one place in town that should have had his back. And when he started the engine, he caught it in the rearview mirror, a black sedan easing to a stop across the street. The person inside didn't step out, didn't move at all, just sat there, staring straight at him. The bar in the middle of town was dark as a cave, the neon sign outside flickering on rusted metal and casting a dirty purple glow. David walked in just looking for air, trying to shake off the hollow fight he'd just had with the sheriff. Sophie was in a safe place for now, left with an old nurse he trusted, but her warning kept ringing in his head. He's going to kill me. David took a corner seat, sat alone, turning a beer glass in his hand without drinking, listening to the sad country music mixing with the forced laughter of locals. But the air shifted fast when the door swung open and a big shadow walked in. Victor Hale. The name he'd heard in whispers around town but had never seen face to face. The man wore a black leather jacket, shoulders wide enough to fill the whole room, his steps slow and steady, like someone who knew he didn't need to rush. The chatter that had filled the bar died out quick, like somebody had sucked the air from the place. David didn't need an introduction. He knew damn well this was the he Sophie had spoken of. Victor walked to the bar, dropped his gloves, then turned to look at David. Cold grey eyes, sharp as a scalpel. He gave a half smile, the kind of smile that came from a man used to giving orders and getting obedience. "You're David Kane, the soldier who just came back, right?" His voice was deep, carried across the room, and nobody else made a sound. David didn't answer. He just stared back. War had taught him that silence could be sharper than any words. Victor took a glass from the bartender, sipped once, then slammed it down hard, the liquor splashing like blood across the wood. "I hear you've been poking around where you don't belong. Old barns, missing kids. You know, that's not the kind of work for a washed-up soldier." Every word was drawn out, like a blade pressed against skin. David's hand locked around his beer, the smell of malt rising but drowned under the stink of smoke and the rot of power bleeding off the man across from him. His body screamed to rise, to put a fist straight through that grin, but instinct held him down. This wasn't some drunk fool. This was the man at the center of the web. Victor leaned in close, his breath thick with smoke. "Let me make it simple. Stay out of it. Everyone who crosses me disappears. That stubborn little soldier in you may not fear death, but trust me, there are worse things than dying." He patted David's shoulder like it was some friendly joke, then let out a low chuckle. The bar stayed frozen, eyes turned away, nobody daring to intervene. David lifted his head, eyes gone dark. He didn't give a word back, only let the rage build inside. His silence wasn't surrender, it was a vow. Victor read it in him, pulled back, his grin fading, eyes flashing one last cold warning before he turned away. David sat still, his hand so tight on the glass it cracked, foam spilling across the table. The music kicked back in, the laughter returned, but all that echoed in his head was the phrase, "Stay out of it." And when he stepped outside, the night wind cut sharp. Under the yellow streetlight at the far end, he caught sight of a man smoking, standing stone still, eyes locked on him, not blinking once. That night, the whole town sat heavy in silence. David drove his old pickup toward the small house where he'd been staying, Victor's threat echoing in his head like a drumbeat. The wind whipped against the glass, the dry dust of the road filling his chest until it burned. He knew the truth. When a man like Victor stepped out in the open and gave a warning, it meant danger wasn't far off. Deep down, David wasn't worried for himself. He was worried about Sophie, the kid who had dropped into his arms a burden heavier than any order he'd ever taken in uniform. When he turned onto the dark road behind the trees, headlights flashed in his mirror. The same black sedan he'd spotted outside the sheriff's office was tailing close. His body tightened instantly, instincts firing. He slowed down, but in a blink, two figures jumped from the roadside shadows, clubs slamming onto his hood. David stomped the brakes, tires screeching loud in the cold night, and the doors were yanked open. A fist like a hammer cracked into his jaw, snapping his head sideways. Blood filled his mouth, ears ringing hard. There were more of them than he thought. At least 3, masked, their moves sharp and practiced. David staggered, but refused to drop. War had taught him that if you go down too quick, you don't get back up. He tucked tight, let the next blow slide off, then threw an elbow straight into the chest of the closest one. The man stumbled back, choking, but the other 2 came in fast. A wooden club smashed into his shoulder, pain flaring like a bullet tearing through. He reeled but spun, driving his knee into the other man's thigh. Bone cracked loud in the night. Still, the longer it went, the weaker he felt. Youth was long gone, leaving only training and sheer stubborn will. A strike from behind dropped him to one knee, the world tilting, body shaking like a bell rung too hard. For a moment everything went dark. Battlefield memories crashing in, friends surrounded, flares ripping the sky, blood-soaking sand. David pulled in one last breath, forced his body up with all that remained. He grabbed a man by the collar, twisted, and slammed him hard to the ground. The air ripped in his ears, the sound of flesh hitting pavement heavy and final. The other two faltered, then bolted into the dark. An engine roared, tires screamed, and the black sedan vanished into the thick night. David braced against the road, chest heaving, sweat and blood dripping down his neck. His whole body screamed with pain, but he was still breathing. He staggered up, eyes searching the truck. Then his heart collapsed inside him. The back seat was empty. The old blanket he'd wrapped around Sophie lay tossed on the ground outside the open door. No cry, no small figure. He stumbled forward, voice breaking raw as he shouted into the night, "Sophie!" The sound carried back only as a cruel echo. Wind tore through the trees, the rustle of leaves whispering like mockery. He fell to his knees, clutching the blanket, his chest crushed under a pain worse than any wound. He had survived, but the child he had sworn to protect was gone, taken into enemy hands. And then he saw it. Far off under a weak streetlight, a scrap of paper pinned to a pole, fluttering in the wind. The words, scrawled rough but clear, told you not to interfere. Morning broke pale, the light weak as it filtered through old trees, laying a cold grey over the dirt road. David pushed himself into the woods, every step burning from the beating he'd taken the night before. Each breath was a blade digging into his chest, but stopping wasn't an option. The old blanket, still holding Sophie's warmth, was stuffed in his jacket pocket, the only thing keeping him from slipping into despair. Last night his shouts had vanished into the wind, leaving him nothing but darkness and that mocking note. Now he had to find her. Even the faintest sign would be enough. The forest smelled damp, mixed with the raw scent of blood in the earth. David dropped to one knee, his hand sweeping over the wet leaves. There it was, a fresh dark brown stain, still clinging, trailing down a narrow path. His heart kicked hard, his throat tightening. He followed it, step after step, the memories pressing in. He'd traced blood trails before, years ago, back in war. They almost always ended in something he wished he'd never seen. Branches scraped his shoulders, the wind hissed through leaves overhead, pressing down on him like weight. And then, just a few yards ahead, he spotted something caught in a thorn bush. His hand shook as he pulled it free. A light blue coat, tiny sleeves, the collar ripped open. A wide patch of blood soaked the side. David's body went weak, his chest twisted tight. He clutched it, cold seeping into his palms. It was Sophie's coat. He stood there, breath stuttering, his head filling with 100 brutal possibilities. Was she alive? Or was this all that was left after some sick torment? He bit down hard, forcing the soldier in him to take control, pushing back the panicked father. He scanned the ground. Footprints, heavy boots stamped over the blood, pointing toward the riverbank. David picked up the trail, walking faster now, still gripping the coat like his own life depended on it. The sound of the river carried through the trees, rushing but distant. Then crack. A branch snapped ahead. David dropped low, pressing his back against a tree. Through the mist he saw a figure moving, carrying something heavy across his shoulders. David's breath froze. Hanging at the man's side was a rope stained with blood, and the muddy boots matched the tracks he'd been following. He wasn't alone. Another man trailed behind, glancing around, eyes sharp. They moved like men guarding contraband, careful, efficient. David pressed himself deeper into the shadows, his body tight as a wire. He wanted to charge, to rip through the distance. But reason cut through. If he tried it alone, he'd be dead in seconds. And if Sophie was still alive, she'd lose her only chance. He gripped the coat, the dry blood stinging his nose, his chest burning with a raw ache. There was no guessing now. She was in their hands. The hunt had started, and Victor wasn't sending warnings anymore. He was sending blood and proof. David eased back, step by step, careful not to make a sound. But then behind him, from the brush, came the sharp, cold sound of a gun being cocked. The sound of the gun being cocked cut sharp through the woods. David spun, fists tight, ready for the end. But instead of a bullet, there came rushing footsteps. A woman's voice rang out, urgent but steady. Put the gun down. He knew it right away. Anna Reed, the town nurse, the one who had patched him up after a scrape just the week before. The man holding the weapon hesitated, then backed off into the trees, leaving behind a silence that pressed on the path like a weight. David's breathing dragged heavy, shoulders heaving. Anna hurried to him, her eyes running over the ripped shoulder and the bruises along his jaw. "Lord, you need stitches right now." David shook his head, trying to wave it off, but his legs buckled. He couldn't fight her, pulling him toward the small cabin she kept at the edge of the woods, where she lived alone, away from the town. Inside the cramped room, lit only by a kerosene lamp, Anna opened her kit and started working on him. The sting of alcohol burned, dragging him back to the moment. Her hands moved fast, practiced like she'd tended to worse wounds more than once. David stayed quiet as long as he could, but the words finally broke out of him. "They've got Sophie." His voice was rough, heavy as stone rolling down a hill. Anna froze, eyes locking with his sadness hardening into resolve. "I believe you," she whispered. Her hand rested on his shoulder, her tone low but firm. "You can't do this alone. Victor's not just some thug. He's got men, money, and people in power watching his back. If you charge straight in, you won't come out alive." David turned his face away, eyes shadowed. "I've survived worse. I can't leave that girl." "And?" Anna sighed, then pulled a thin file from an old cabinet. "I'm not telling you to leave her, but at least know who you're up against. These are medical files I was forced to alter when I worked for the county health office. Kids written up as accidents or malnutrition, but the truth is, they came from families under Victor's thumb. There's also a shipping schedule for the river dock. I kept a copy. /" David took the papers, eyes running over numbers, dates, names of children who had disappeared. His chest tightened, but in the middle of the darkness, something sparked. This was proof. This was a real lead. He looked back at Anna, for the first time in days catching a glimpse of hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice thin but steady. Anna closed the kit, her gaze holding on him longer than necessary. "If you're going further, you'll need a guide. Just remember, once the last streetlight goes out, every eye in this town belongs to him." David nodded slowly, feeling the weight lift just a little. For the first time, he wasn't alone. He leaned back in the wooden chair, still clutching the file. And then the cabin door rattled hard. A shadow stretched across the crack of light, a figure standing silent at the threshold. The knocking on the cabin door dragged on, then went dead silent. When David cracked it open, the porch was empty, just a slip of paper shoved under the frame. A crooked arrow, one word scrawled beside it: "River." His gut clenched. It could be a trap, but it also might be his only chance to find where Victor was keeping Sophie. He stuffed Anna's file into his jacket, told her to bolt the door, then headed out, pushing through pain that hadn't healed. By nightfall, fog rolled off the river like smoke, coating the abandoned dock. David crouched in the reeds, eyes scanning every move. Then headlights swept across the water, and what he saw turned his stomach. A black truck eased in, cutting its lights as it stopped. 4 big men jumped out, dragging heavy wooden crates. He didn't need to see inside to know. The muffled sobs, the frantic little knocks from within said it all. David's fists dug deep into his palms. He'd lived through gunfire and mortar blasts, but the sound of kids locked in crates that was worse than any war. The men hauled each box onto a waiting motorboat. The driver smoked, exhaling into the night, his face blank with the kind of indifference only a man who treats human lives as cargo can wear. David saw it clear this wasn't some backroom deal. It was a system, smooth and steady, running right here on American soil. He pulled a small camera from his pocket and snapped fast. The lens caught tiny hands reaching out through the slats before being shoved back inside. His throat locked, rage boiling, but he forced himself quiet. Each image burned into his brain, carving new scars on top of old ones. Then a tall figure stepped from the trees. The weak light cut across him, and David recognized him instantly: Victor. Long coat, hands in his pockets, moving calm like this was nothing more than freight. He gave a short order to the boatman. "Stay on schedule. Another run tomorrow night." His rough laugh carried over the damp air, souring David's gut. David stayed still. He couldn't break cover, couldn't fire, not against that many men. That would kill Sophie faster than anything, but he couldn't turn away either. Right there, he faced the true face of evil. Not a war in some far-off land. It was here, in a quiet American town, where children were turned into cargo floating downriver. When the boat roared off, its engine chewing the night, David sank deeper into the dark, eyes locked on its trail. His chest burned hot, each breath like fire. He knew now it wasn't just about Sophie. This was a whole rotten network, and Victor was only one hand on the wheel of a machine built on stolen lives. David clutched the file against his chest, fury and disgust choking him. But before he could slip away, a branch cracked behind him. A cold hand clamped down on his shoulder from the shadows. David came back to town at first light, his steps dragging, every bruise from the night before still screaming through his body. In his jacket, the photos he'd taken at the river dug into him like knives. He knew what they were proof. the kind nobody in this town wanted to face. And if there was any place left to take them, it had to be Sheriff Cole's office. Doubt clawed at him, but he forced himself up those steps, clinging to the idea that the law might still hold some scrap of justice. Cole sat behind his desk, coffee steaming, his eyes distant. David dropped the file and the stack of photos hard onto the table, his voice heavy as steel. "This is what you need to see. Victor's running kids down the river. I saw it with my own eyes." His finger shook, not from fear but from the anger he was holding back. Cole flipped through the pictures. For a moment his gaze dipped, then his face snapped back to cold. He nudged his cigarette aside and gave a dry smile. "Kane, around here what you call evidence is just rumor. Blurry photos taken at night? Who's going to vouch for that?" David slammed his hand down, the crack of wood filling the room. "You can't deny it. These are children. I heard them crying. I saw them locked up like animals." His voice broke, his body trembling with fury. But Cole just sat there, calm as stone, like he was staring at nothing more than a rattled soldier. The sheriff sighed, gathered the photos into a neat pile. Then, to David's horror, he shoved them straight into the fire in the corner. The crackle of burning film, the flames licking across faint young faces, turning them into ash. David lunged, but Cole stepped in front, eyes hard as rock. "That's enough. I don't want to hear more. You're stirring fear, and I won't let you drag this town down." David froze, his hands trembling. Out in the service, betrayal by the enemy was expected, but betrayal from someone meant to stand guard over justice that cut deeper than any blade. He stared at the ashes, the weight of failure pressing down. Every risk, every sacrifice, gone up in smoke. Cole leaned back, his voice cold. "This is your last warning. If you keep pushing, I'll treat you as a threat, and the law will handle you the same as any other." The words hung heavy, like a noose tightening around his neck. David wanted to shout, to tear the desk apart, but all he could do was stand there, his rage breaking in his ragged breathing. He turned and walked out. Noon sunlight hit him hard, hot as a whip across the back. The town kept moving, vendors setting up stalls, kids laughing on the sidewalks, and David stood still in it all, a man stripped of his last chance to believe in justice. At the bottom of the steps came the slam of a car door. He turned. The black sedan again. This time, the window slid down, and Victor's eyes met his. That smirk on his face said it clear. "You're on your own now." It wasn't even fully dark when David got cut off in the middle of the street. 2 patrol cars blocked the road, red lights flashing, and Sheriff Cole stood there, face hard as stone. "David Kane, you're under arrest for disturbing the peace and resisting lawful authority." Cole read flat, while his men rushed in, twisting David's arms behind his back and snapping on the cuffs. David didn't fight, didn't yell. Every shove, every move, only made it clearer. Victor had his claws deep into this town, right down to the bone. The county jail was damp and stinking, the walls sweating rust. They threw David into an empty cell, his back smacking the cold concrete floor. Night fell heavy, and just when he thought he might get a moment's rest, the iron door screeched open. 3 men walked in, no uniforms. Their eyes gave them away. They weren't lawmen, they were victors. No words, they just came at him. The first punch split his lip, blood flooding his mouth. A wooden baton slammed into his ribs, pain ripping down his spine. David curled tight, trying to shield his head and face. On the battlefield, he'd been buried under fire, but never had he felt so alone. Kicks rained down, laughter echoing in the dark cell. One leaned close, hissed in his ear, "Didn't listen. Now you'll learn to stay quiet." David dropped, gasping, but somewhere inside, that old willpower surged. He saw Sophie in his mind, her eyes wide on the bridge, her voice whispering, "He's going to kill me." The pain twisted into fuel. When the third man bent low, David surged up, smashing his forehead into the guy's nose. The crack was sharp, blood spraying. The other 2 froze, then lunged, but the wail of an alarm outside the hall sent them scrambling. They bolted, leaving him bleeding in the dark. David sagged, soaked in blood and sweat, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He thought he might black out when the door eased open again. A small beam of light cut the dark. Anna. She dropped beside him, her hands quick but shaking as she checked his wounds. "God, what did they do to you?" Her voice broke. David gave a dry laugh, blood at the corner of his mouth. "Just a lesson, but I'm still here." Anna pulled a ring of keys from her pocket, eyes darting nervously. "I begged the prison doctor to let me cover tonight. I've got 10 minutes before the next shift comes in. If you get out, you owe me one promise. Live and keep going." David forced himself up, legs trembling but his eyes blazing again. He knew this wasn't just kindness. It was a gamble, one that could cost Anna her job, her standing, maybe worse. The lock clanked open, and the door slid wide. Night air rushed in, carrying the sharp mix of freedom and danger. Leaning on Anna's shoulder, David stepped out, heart pounding like a war drum. But as they turned down the back hall, another beam of light hit them square in the face. Sheriff Cole's voice came cold from the shadows. "I warned you, David. And you, Anna, you think you'll walk away from this?" Cole's flashlight cut straight into David's eyes, blinding him. But instead of folding, his mind slipped back. The smell of dried blood, the bite of gunpowder, the hiss of flares tearing through a valley sky. Coast, years ago. His squad was trapped, the exit cut off, minutes from being wiped out. The screams of men he knew, their trembling hands passing along the last clip of ammo, it all came back like ghosts branded into him with hot iron. He saw Ramirez's face, falling right beside him, eyes wide open in the smoke, and he remembered that moment when he had no choice but to stand, to shout, to lead, even though he was nothing but fear inside. Now, in the white glare of the jailhouse hall, David's heart pounded the same rhythm as that battlefield. The nightmare wasn't just pain anymore, it was a reminder. He had survived when no one thought it possible. Cole's stare, Victor's sneer, they layered right over the faces of old enemies, and he knew if he broke here, Sophie would vanish forever, and every sacrifice made would be dust. Anna whispered beside him, "David, we have to run." Her voice shook, but her eyes carried fire. That thread pulled him back to the present, stitching his memories together. He gave a small nod, shoulders quivering from pain, but his eyes steady as stone. The old tactics came back. No straight fight. Use the dark. Use surprise. Use the guts you've got left. Cole stepped closer, gun leveled, his voice flat as steel. "Tonight, it ends." David leaned slightly toward Anna, whispering, "Trust me." In that instant, he wasn't a broken prisoner anymore. He was a soldier again, a man in command. The ache in his ribs turned into a war drum, sending blood to his limbs. He crouched low, his body primed like he was about to break through a line of fire. All those memories, explosions, light, blood, sand, shifted into fuel. The dark wasn't just dangerous now, it was a chance. His survival instinct flared, forging something colder, sharper. He would not let Sophie's name be added to the list of the lost. His eyes swept the hall, mapping doors, cracks, every piece of cover. He measured it like a battlefield. Anna's hand tightened on his arm, as if she meant to share not only her fear but her strength. Cole narrowed his eyes, maybe catching the change in David's stance, and lifted the gun higher. The air was so thick every breath sounded like an alarm. David drew one deep breath, eyes burning with the fire that had risen out of all that darkness. And just as Cole squeezed the trigger, the lights died. The hallway plunged into black. The blackout swallowed the jail. Chaos buzzing for only minutes, enough time for David and Anna to slip out the back. They tore through the night, sirens wailing behind them, but the trees shielded their escape. When they finally ducked into an abandoned shack by the river, David leaned against the wood wall, chest heaving. Blood still seeped from his wounds, but in his eyes was something new, a spark. If he wanted to save Sophie, he had to strike at Victor's stronghold. No more stumbling blind. Anna pulled out the wrinkled file she'd shown him before. "There are old addresses in here, but I think his main office at the docks is the key. That's where he keeps records." David nodded, pulse tightening. Breaking into the heart of the beast was reckless, but years of recon had taught him without intel, death was certain. The next night, he crept toward the brick building Victor used as an office. Iron gate locked, 2 guards at the front. David stayed low in the dark, watching until they lit cigarettes and started chatting. A rock tossed far off drew their attention, and he slid through a back door gap. Breath held, every move slow and precise, like crawling across a minefield. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and damp wood. A desk lamp flickered weakly over piles of ledgers and files. David moved fast, hands trembling from the pressure of time. Then he found it, a black notebook, corner stained with water. He opened it. Names filled the pages, each one with dates and codes. His heart hammered. Every line was a child turned into cargo. And then he froze. A name he knew. Sophie Miller, Shipment 23, Dock 4. His chest clamped tight. No more whispers, no more guesses. This was proof. Sophie was on the list. He bit down hard, turned more pages, finding other names kids the town thought had simply moved away. Hope flickered in him, but so did urgency. He yanked the book, stuffed it in his jacket. Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the hall. The ceiling light snapped on, flooding the room. David pressed against the wall, knife cold in his hand, pulse beating like a war drum. The door swung wide. A heavy-set man stepped in, eyes dull but gun in hand. David held still, blade ready. Before he could strike, Victor's voice rolled down the hall, low and rough. "Lock the door. Someone wants to play curious tonight." David slipped out of Victor's office by a hair, the black notebook pressed tight under his jacket. Every stride he took through the night was a heartbeat gone wild, burning hot with both fear and resolve. He knew holding the proof was only half the battle. The other half was dragging it into the light before Victor could crush every trace. And in a town where folks whispered in shadows, the local paper was the only voice that could reach past the walls of power. At daybreak, he walked into the little newsroom at the end of Main Street. Old brick, sign faded, but inside the editor, pushing past 60, still clinging to what print was supposed to mean, kept a small flame of belief alive. David set the notebook and his notes down on the desk. This is the truth. People need to see it. The editor scanned the pages, horror flickering in his eyes, then his brow tightened. "You know publishing this is signing our own death warrant." David's reply came low, rough from lack of sleep. "I was there. I heard them cry. If you stay silent, more blood spills." Something in David's stare broke the man's hesitation. He gave a slow nod. That whole day, the small staff bent over their desks, writing, snapping photos, setting the presses for a special issue. David sat in the corner, body aching, but his spirit locked onto each word as it made its way onto paper. For the first time, the truth felt like it had escaped the cage. By morning, the paper hit the street. Bold headline. Victor named, his river trade laid bare. Townsfolk clutched copies, murmuring on the sidewalks, whispers growing into open talk. David stood at the end of the street, watching hope cut through the fog like sunlight. For a moment, justice had a voice. But the moment didn't last. By evening, when he came back to the office, the sight stopped him cold. The whole building was choking black smoke, flames licking through windows, scorched papers scattered across the street. The townspeople stood back, silent, no one moving to help. The editor sat on the curb, face grey with ash, eyes vacant. His words stumbled out. "They came too fast. Nothing we could do. Every copy's gone." David dropped to his knees, grabbed a half-burnt page, the print smeared to charcoal. Rage boiled up, catching in his throat. Victor had struck back, turning truth to ash in a matter of hours. Everything blood, sweat, hope, snuffed out without mercy. He looked around. Faces turned away, eyes cast to the ground. No one dared to speak, no one dared to touch. The whole town drowned in a silence heavier than gunfire. David's hand trembled, clutching the charred page. One thought carved deep into him. If truth couldn't live in the light, he'd drag the darkness into daylight with his own hands. And through the haze of smoke, he saw it, Victor's truck rolling slow down the street, window sliding low, that crooked grin flashing like a dare. After the fire at the paper, David knew the town had nothing left for him. He walked through streets dusted with ash, his mind wound tight as wire. That's when he found it slipped under the wiper of his old truck. Just a scrap of paper, a few words scrawled, "If you want Sophie, North Quarry, midnight." The handwriting was sloppy, but the meaning was clear, a death sentence dressed as an invitation. Even so, his heart gave him no choice. He packed what he had left from the service, some old cans, a little homemade explosive, a flash fuse. His scout's gut told him it was a trap, but it was the last thread tied to Sophie. Night dropped heavy. The quarry sat open like a raw wound in the earth. Sheer walls shone in the moonlight, wind howling through the pit, like voices crying. David moved slow, gun steady, every nerve stretched thin. A clang of metal rang ahead. He edged closer, then floodlights snapped on, blinding him. Figures stood on the rim above, at least 4. Faces covered. Laughter rolled down. "Looking for the girl, Kane? Then dig for her." Before he could react, the ground under him gave way. The earth had been hollowed out. He slid hard down the pit, smashing into rock, pain biting through his body. His knee tore open, breath ragged. Above, shovels scraped. Dirt and stone rained down, shovel after shovel, sealing the hole. Dust filled his lungs, darkness pressing in. Panic clawed at his throat. He thought of Sophie maybe trapped in pits like this, waiting for a hand that never came. But through the fear, his old survival instinct broke loose. His fingers found the tin can smoke charge in his jacket. Hands shaking, he struck the fuse. A crack popped, smoke poured upward. Curses rained from above as the men coughed and stumbled back. David used the chaos, clawing at the rock wall, fingers ripping raw but holding. The pit filled with smoke, hiding him. He dragged himself out, rolled behind a boulder, lungs burning. His heart pounded like a hammer, body near breaking, but survival drove him on. Boots thudded around him, the gang searching through the haze. David lay still, gun tight in his grip, waiting for the right second. When the smoke thinned, He slid from cover and ran along the edge of the quarry. Moonlight caught on something ahead, something small and shining. He stopped cold. A child's shoe, muddy, streaked with dried blood, wedged in a crack of stone. His chest clenched, and behind him came a voice he knew too well, cold as a blade. "I told you, Cain. You don't walk out of my game." David staggered in his own breath, sweat mixed with blood blurring his vision. That small shoe wedged in the rock haunted him like a curse. He reached for it, but his pocket buzzed hard. The phone lit, an unknown number. He lifted it to his ear. Victor's voice came through, low and sharp as steel. "I'm done with this cat and mouse, Cain. If you want the girl alive, you stop. And I've got something to make sure you understand the rules." The line shifted, and another sound took over, muffled cries, desperate. "Anna." Her voice cracked through the wind on the receiver. "David, don't, they'll kill." The call snapped off, leaving nothing but ice in his chest. His knees buckled, hands shaking. In his head he saw Anna dragged into darkness, wrists bound, terror in her eyes. The bruises, the beatings, the blood, all of it shrank compared to the blow inside his chest. He had dragged her into this fight, and now Victor had made her a pawn to shut him down. He spent the night at the quarry's edge, the thin moonlight stretching across his hollow face. He'd survived ambushes, he'd clawed out of graves, but he had never felt so powerless. A battlefield had rules. This game had none, just cruelty without end. He wanted to charge in, rip through doors and walls, but his mind told him plain, do that, and both Anna and Sophie die. His heart split down the middle, each beat hitting like a hammer. By morning, David made his way back to Anna's cabin, hoping for a clue. The wooden door swung open. Inside was wreckage. Cups shattered on the floor, drag marks in the dust. The smell of antiseptic still hung in the air, a brutal reminder that the one safe place left had been ripped away. David grabbed a tipped bottle of alcohol, his chest locking up. For a moment, his will cracked. He collapsed into a chair, face buried in his hands, breath broken and shallow. The wind hissed at the window, carrying with it a white envelope left on the sill. David tore it open. Inside was a single photo. Anna bound, mouth gagged, eyes wild with terror. In the corner, the stamp of a warehouse near the river docks. At the bottom, a scrawl. "One more step, and I cut her breath right in front of you." David's grip crushed the photo, blood rushing to his face, heart stabbing as if pierced. His whole body shook not from fear, but from despair tightening like a noose. For the first time, the road ahead looked blank. And then, outside, the rumble of a familiar truck engine rolled through the alley. A tall figure stood in its shadow, staring straight into the cabin. Victor. Victor only stood in the alley for a few seconds that night, but it was enough. His stare cut into David like a victory speech without words, and then the truck rolled off. For the rest of the night, David sat motionless in the broken-down cabin, clutching the photo of Anna bound and gagged. Every gust of wind slicing through the cracks in the walls felt like another cut in his spirit. When dawn came, he made one last choice he thought might still matter. Go back to the townsfolk, ask them to stand, even if it was just one of them. He walked into the corner store first, a place that once felt like part of his own breath. The old shopkeeper looked up, then dropped his eyes. David tried, voice raw. "You know I'm not lying. I've got proof Victor's taking kids. Anna, she's been taken, and Sophie." But before he could finish, the man cut him off, his tone flat and cold. "You should leave, Cain. Don't drag us into it." His hand shook, but his back was turned, and the door slammed shut like a steel wall. David stepped back into the glare of the sun, stomach sinking. He tried again at the cafe, once full of chatter, but the moment he walked in, every whisper cut off. Familiar faces, the same ones who greeted him when he first came home, now looked away. A mother pulled her child close, as if he were the danger. David tapped the counter, voice cracking. "Victor's bought you all, hasn't he? Can't anyone see what's right in front of them?" But instead of an answer, the waitress laid down a blank check slip and walked away. The whole afternoon he kept going. The church, the gas station, the bar, everywhere it was, the same wall, cold, solid, unbroken. Heads bowed, eyes dodged, doors shut. He understood then what Victor had done. Turned him into the outsider, the troublemaker, the man nobody wanted to touch. The truth was too dangerous for them. To see it meant standing against power they knew they couldn't beat. By nightfall, David dragged himself to the end of Maine, chest heavy as stone. He felt like a ghost, wandering the very town he once called home. No allies, no shelter, only war memories and Anna's picture pinning him to despair. Maybe this was how Victor planned to finish him, not with a bullet, but by grinding him down with loneliness until every breath felt like a burden. He stood on the sidewalk, staring at rows of shuttered windows, yellow lamplight leaking out but cold as ice. A low growl rose in his throat, anger pushing up, but it caught, choked down into silence, because shouting wouldn't make anyone hear. Night dropped like a curtain, swallowing him in the quiet of collective betrayal. And then, as he turned to leave the street, a police cruiser slid to a stop in front of him. The window rolled down. Sheriff Cole's face showed in the glow, a thin smile stretched across his lips. "I told you, Kane. Nobody here needs you. Now it's time you disappeared." David froze under Cole's mocking smile, his eyes hard as stone. Then the cruiser rolled away, leaving him alone on that dead quiet street. His chest felt like lead, every strand of hope torn loose. He stumbled back to the shack at the edge of the woods, dropped into a wooden chair, his head in his hands. The night wind cut through the gaps, carrying the smell of damp rot. For a moment, he believed everything was gone. Sophie, Anna, even the town's will to believe. Then, from outside the door, the faintest sound, small steps, lost and broken. David snapped up, knife tight in his fist. The hinges groaned, and a tiny shape collapsed inside. Sophie, her face pale, streaked with dried blood across her brow, bare feet raw and bleeding, clothes ripped to shreds. She looked up at him, lips trembling, whispering two words. "Uncle, David." He rushed over, scooping her up. Her body was light, cold, fragile enough to break his chest in two. "Dear God, the girl's alive," he muttered. Sophie sobbed, clinging to his shirt with tiny hands like she feared he'd vanish. Bruises mapped her arms, rope burns carved deep into her wrists and neck. David's jaw locked, grief turning into fire. But under that fire, a flicker broke through. She was still here. When her breathing steadied, Sophie pulled a crumpled paper from her torn shirt. "I took it. I escaped," she whispered. David unfolded it. His eyes scanned fast. Shipping lists, coded marks matching the black ledger he'd seen. But this time, clear at the bottom, Victor's signature, stamped with his front company's seal. Proof. Unshakable. David's voice was low, searching. "Where did you get this?" Sophie shivered, voice soft as wind. "From his room. I crawled out the window." He held her tight, for the first time in days feeling something like faith spark alive. The girl had survived, and the truth now had shape. No rumor, no charred photos. This was evidence that could face the world. Inside him, despair cracked open, making room for a new resolve. He patched her wounds as best he could, laid her under an old blanket. Outside, the woods still moaned with wind, but inside that shack, a fragile warmth took hold. David sat guard, eyes fixed on the paper in his hand. He knew one slip, and Victor would erase it all, like before. But this time he had what Victor never saw coming. A child who lived, a witness, and proof no fire could burn away. That night, David barely slept. When Sophie drifted off, he stood at the door, chest rising heavy with this reborn conviction. The fight ahead would be long, bloody, but he wasn't alone anymore. Faith had come back, fragile but enough to make him rise. And just then, deep in the trees, headlights cut through, stopping near the shack. A man's voice carried cold through the night. "I want the girl. Hand her over, Kane." David carried Sophie out of the shack with urgency, headlights still sweeping the woods behind them like a predator tracking scent. He knew they couldn't stay. The only place left that might shelter them was the old church on the hill, abandoned for years. Its heavy wooden door groaned when he pushed it open, dust rising in clouds, but inside it was wide and draftless, good enough to hide for a night. The rusted bell above swayed in the wind, clanging against itself like a warning. Sophie sat down on a pew, eyes sunken from exhaustion. David knelt in front of her, his voice rough but softened. "From here on, you stay quiet, you hear? Tonight's the last step. If we do this right, we bring Anna out." Sophie nodded faintly, her small hand gripping the crumpled sheet of evidence like it was her lifeline. Watching those trembling fingers, David felt both sorrow and a fire rising inside him. On the altar he spread an old map, laying out notes and symbols. Piece by piece, the black ledger and Sophie's paper lined up into a schedule. Victor was using warehouse number 4 at the river docks to hold Anna before shipping the next load. David carved quick markings into the wood with his knife entry, exit, guard posts. He knew there'd be at least half a dozen men stationed there. Just him, worn down, and a child. It was suicide. But to quit meant Victor won. In silence, David dug into his pack, pulling out scraps, tin cans, fuse wire, oil rags. He showed Sophie how to tie knots, how to light a smoke charge. "If it all goes bad, you throw this and run. Don't come back." His voice was hoarse, but firm. Sophie's eyes welled, her answer soft but cutting. "I won't leave you." The words stopped him cold. tightening every muscle in his chest. He placed a hand on her shoulder, forcing a small smile. "As long as you're breathing, we haven't lost yet." Olu. Outside, the wind howled through broken windows, moonlight spilling across the cracked pulpit. David rose, walking slow across the sanctuary, each step heavy like it was his last march. War memories poured back, but this time he didn't turn away. The fear pressed tight, but his resolve hardened into a plan. He marked the hour to strike before dawn, when Victor believed every enemy was already crushed. Sophie curled up on a bench, drifting into sleep, still clutching the paper. David laid his coat over her, eyes locked on the dark window. They had one night to prepare, one last night before stepping into the wolf's den. His heart pounded, every breath heavy as stone, but inside burned a cold, steady resolve. All or nothing. Near midnight, just as David eased back, tires crunched over gravel outside. Headlights cut through the broken glass, sweeping across a shattered statue of the saint. A harsh voice barked from the doorway. "We know you're in there, Kane. Bring the girl out." War drum. Up on the deck above, guards moved back and forth, rifles catching the glow of weak yellow lamps. This was it. No more hiding, no more running. Either it ended here, or it didn't end at all. David crouched low, pressed his back against the cold planks, and motioned to Sophie. The girl slid into a corner tucked between crates, her small frame swallowed by the shadows. She clutched that crumpled sheet of paper with Victor's signature like it was her last anchor. David gave her one nod, then turned and crawled up the narrow stairwell that led inside the ship's hold. His body ached from wounds that never healed, but his mind was steady, locked on what had to be done. Inside, the air was thick with oil fumes, damp wood, and cigarette smoke. Rows of sealed crates filled the space, stacked to the ceiling, forming walls of pine that smelled of mildew. Some of them shuddered faintly. From inside came the faintest tapping, small fists, weak, desperate. Children. The sound stopped, David cold, his throat closing, his grip tightening on the pistol. He swallowed hard, forcing himself forward. A scrape behind him. A shadow lunged. Instinct took over. David spun and pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked like thunder, the bullet slamming into the attacker's chest. The man staggered back, crashing into the crates, dead before he hit the ground. The report echoed through the hold, and then the shouting began. Boots thundered overhead. The hornet's nest was open now. The first wave came fast. Victor's men poured into the space, rifles spitting fire. Bullets punched holes through crates, wood splintering into clouds of dust and sparks. David dove behind a stack, firing back in tight bursts, each shot measured, each breath ragged like it was his last. The noise filled every corner, gunfire, the ripping wood, and beneath it all, muffled sobs of children locked in boxes like cargo. A bullet tore past his shoulder, hot and sharp, cutting flesh. Blood trickled warm down his arm. He clenched his teeth, forced himself upright, and returned fire, dropping 2 more men. His vision blurred in the haze of gun smoke, every breath pulling poison into his lungs. He kept moving, rolling from cover to cover, squeezing off rounds until the slide locked back empty. In the chaos, one of the guards spotted Sophie. She had tried to stay hidden, crouched in the dark corner, but the man's hand clamped around her wrist, yanking her screaming into the open. Her cry cut through the gunfire like glass breaking. David's blood froze. He surged to his feet, sprinting across the deck. His pistol was empty, so he swung it like a club, smashing the heavy steel butt into the man's skull. The guard staggered, but held on tight to Sophie, dragging her toward the hatch. David roared, ramming into him with his full weight, tearing Sophie free. The man drew a knife, blade glinting through the haze, and lunged. David twisted, fumbling at his side, yanking free the small backup pistol he'd kept tucked at his hip. The barrel barked once. The man jerked, eyes wide, then crumpled, the knife clattering to the floorboards. Sophie buried her face in David's chest, sobbing, her whole body trembling. Then the fire started. A crate, split by bullets, burst into flames. Oil-soaked rags inside catching like tinder. Smoke coiled upward, heat spreading fast. Within minutes, the hold turned into a furnace, every breath scraping fire down David's throat. He dragged Sophie behind a support beam, shielding her as sparks rained from the ceiling. And through the smoke, through the glow of rising flames, Victor walked in. He looked untouched by the chaos, long coat swinging, pistol heavy in his hand. A smirk curling his lips like this was all theater staged for him. His voice carried steady over the crackle of burning wood. "You're stubborn, Kane. I told you before, everything ends in ashes." David pulled Sophie behind him, planting his feet firm, his eyes locked on Victor's. The flames threw their faces into stark relief, one man battered and scarred, a soldier who'd carried war home in his bones. The other, a predator dressed as a businessman, feeding on fear and power. They stood only steps apart. No cover, no escape. Just the end, waiting. Victor raised his pistol, finger curling around the trigger. His eyes gleamed cold in the firelight. David lifted his own weapon, blood dripping from his hand, sweat running with salt across cracked lips. The world held its breath. All the noise, all the chaos collapsed into this one moment. Every choice David had made, every fight, every loss, narrowed down to the space of a single breath. For a second, nothing moved. Just the hiss of fire, the distant cries from inside the crates, Sophie's breath hot against David's back. His grip tightened, his mind clear. He knew this was it. And then above them, the horn of another ship split the dawn. A deep, piercing blast cut through smoke and gunfire, rattling the deck under their feet. A second horn followed. Louder, closer. Lights swept across the fog, beams catching the burning ship in their glare. Engines roared. Waves slapped hard against the dock as another vessel pulled in. David's heart jolted. Reinforcements. Someone else had come. Victor's smirk flickered for the first time. The battle wasn't finished, not yet. The horn of the ship shook the hull, a sound so deep it rattled David's bones. For a split second, Victor turned his head, and that was all the opening David needed. He surged forward, squeezing the trigger twice. The confined hold roared with gunfire. One round punched into Victor's chest, slamming him back. His long coat flared as the fabric bloomed red. The second shot shattered the quiet for good. Victor's eyes went wide, grey and burning with a hatred that hadn't yet had time to fade. Then his body folded, hitting the deck hard, lifeless except for the final twitch of his hand clawing at the air. David's arms trembled. The pistol nearly slipped from his grip. He fell to his knees, pulling Sophie into him. The girl wrapped her arms tight around his neck, her face streaked with dirt, blood, and tears, but her eyes brimming with life. The fire climbed higher, crackling, devouring the ship, plank by plank. The smell of burning wood mixed with the stench of oil, and the roar of flames blended with the river's rushing current. It sounded like the world breaking apart, but in David's chest there was only the sound of his heartbeat, still stubbornly strong. Outside, lights tore through the fog. Federal agents flooded the dock, rifles raised, voices cutting through the smoke. Sheriff Cole was dragged out in cuffs, his arms bent behind him, his head hanging low. The swagger was gone. What remained was shame. An officer read the charges in a voice as cold as the river wind: conspiracy, destruction of evidence, protection of a child trafficking network. Cole tried to jerk away, but the chains held. The crowd stood back, townspeople watching from the shadows. No one cheered, no one called out. They only stared, their silence thicker than any gunshot silence, heavy with disgrace. Then Anna appeared. They pulled her from one of the containers, her face bruised, her clothes torn, but her eyes still shining, still defiant. When she saw David and Sophie, she broke. Tears streamed as she threw her arms around them both, holding on like she'd never let go. David let the pistol slip from his hand at last, clattering against the boards. His shoulders sagged. The weight that had been crushing his chest for nights finally broke loose, running out of him as tears he didn't try to hide. All the pain, the fear, the endless nights wound tight in his gut, all of it poured out in the warmth of that embrace. Morning spread across the river, grey light stretching into gold. David led Sophie back to the old bridge where it had all begun. The fog lifted in slow ribbons, sunlight spilling over the cracked railings. He knelt, meeting the girl's eyes. Sophie held the rope that once threatened to end her life. Her small hand shook, but this time she let go, letting it tumble down into the water. They watched together as the current carried it away, swallowed by the river's steady flow. Her voice was barely a whisper, but steady. "I'm not afraid anymore, because now I have you." David pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. His tears burned, but they weren't the old kind. They weren't for loss, but for release. In that moment he understood what this fight had really given him. It wasn't just saving Sophie, it was salvaging a piece of himself, the piece he thought he'd left, buried in the sand and blood of some foreign battlefield. But the fight wasn't over. The black ledger sat in his coat, pages fluttering in the wind. When the breeze caught it, one sheet opened wide, names scrawled line after line. Each name was a child. Some crossed out, many still not. Each was a life stolen, each a shadow still waiting to be dragged back into the light. Victor was gone, Cole was in chains, but the network that fed on children's lives was still out there. David's jaw clenched as he snapped the book shut. He rose, taking Sophie's hand in his. Across the river, the old warehouses stood silent, empty shells in the daylight, but still heavy with secrets. They looked like graves that hadn't yet been dug up. The town behind him remained quiet, weighed down by the shame of its silence. And he knew, as sure as he'd ever known anything, that the war wasn't done. The morning wind carried Sophie's whisper again through his mind, the first one he'd ever heard from her. "He's going to kill me." Back then it had been pure terror. Now it sounded different. It was a warning, a reminder, a vow. This fight was far from finished. David squeezed Sophie's hand, feeling the warmth of her grip against his calloused palm. He looked out at the warehouses and beyond, into the horizon still wrapped in mist. His heart carried the weight of both despair and hope. For the first time in years, hope was stronger. The war wasn't over, but neither was he. This story reminds us of something most folks would rather not face. Evil doesn't always come wearing an enemy's uniform, marching across some distant battlefield. Sometimes it lives right here, in the quiet corners of a community that looks peaceful on the surface. It hides behind friendly smiles, behind locked doors, and inside buildings we pass every day without a second thought. And when it does, it's harder to see, harder to name, and so much easier to ignore. The truth is, when people turn their backs, when they look away, when they decide silence is easier than risk, that silence becomes more dangerous than any weapon. Violence you can see, you can brace yourself for it. But silence? Silence is like smoke. It seeps under doors, fills the air, and chokes out what's left of courage. In this story, the sheriff's badge meant nothing. The neighbor's eyes turned cold, and the whole town wrapped itself in that silence. And for David, standing alone against it all, that silence felt heavier than any bullet ever could. But here's the thing, it doesn't take an army to break it. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up, even if their knees are shaking, even if the odds are stacked against them. One man saying, "No, I won't look away. No, I won't keep my mouth shut." That single act is like striking a match in a dark cave. It doesn't end the darkness, but it proves it can be pushed back. For those of us standing somewhere in the middle of life, not young anymore, not yet finished, it's a reminder worth holding on to. The greatest measure of a person isn't muscle or strength in their hands. We all know age wears that down. What doesn't fade, unless you let it, is the courage to hold on to your dignity. And with that dignity comes the duty to protect the vulnerable, the children, the forgotten, the ones who can't fight for themselves. In a world quick to praise power, we forget sometimes that the real strength shows up in the quiet moments, when you decide to stand guard for someone else. David didn't win medals for what he did that night. There weren't parades waiting at the end of his fight. What he did was wrestle a little girl away from a rope, from the weight of fear no child should ever carry. And maybe that's the real victory worth talking about, not glory, not headlines, but the simple act of keeping one child from lifting a rope with trembling hands. Think about that for a moment. A child's hand, small and fragile, wrapped around something that should never have been there in the first place. That's not just her battle, it's ours. It's a mirror held up to the adults who surround her, parents, neighbors, leaders, asking the question, will you stand by and watch, or will you take the rope away? Most of us will never face war again. Most of us won't have to walk into a burning warehouse or stare down a man like Victor, but we will be tested, each in our own way. Maybe it'll be when a neighbor needs someone to speak up. Maybe it'll be when a child at church or school shows up with bruises no one wants to ask about. Maybe it'll be when corruption sits across the table, smiling, waiting for you to look away. Those are the battles most of us will actually fight, right here at home. And those battles matter just as much as the ones fought with guns overseas. So if this story teaches anything, it's that you don't need to be young, or strong, or fearless. You just need to be stubborn enough to keep your humanity intact, to refuse to hand it over to fear or convenience. At our age, midlife, past the point of chasing medals, the prize is different. The prize is looking in the mirror and knowing you didn't let the world turn you cold. The prize is knowing that somewhere, because you stood up, a child put down the rope and walked away from the edge. That's the kind of victory no one can take away. Are you watching this video in the morning, with a cup of coffee in your hand, or at night, when the house is quiet and the day is finally done? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear how and when you join us. And if these stories of soldiers returning home speak to you, if they stir something in your heart or remind you of someone you once knew, make sure to subscribe to the Soldiers Coming Home channel so you can be here with us for every new story that unfolds.